Good evening. My name is Susan Yelich-Binietsky, and I'm an assistant director with the Institute of World Affairs at UWM Center for International Education. Welcome this evening to the program, Who Speaks for Islam? Before I get to introducing our speaker, there are a few thank yous that I have. I'd like to thank the U.S. Center for Citizen Diplomacy, the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, the Islamic Center of Milwaukee, who generously co-sponsored this event, the Center for International Education, of which we are a part, and, of course, Milwaukee Public Television and the Institute of World Affairs members. I would encourage you, if you are not, to look at our membership and see my colleague Rachel Schrag at the desk in the lobby. I'd like to also thank the folks that worked behind the scenes for this program, my colleague Rachel Schrag and the two students that work with us, Miranda Mackey and Natasha Sharp. Coming up, we have the global water crisis next week on Tuesday, October 27th, and a movie which will be held here, and also a movie showing Life After the Fall, which will be in the Union Theater on Tuesday, November 3rd and Wednesday, November 4th. More information about those programs is also available. As for the format this evening, Ms. Dalia Mogahed will be addressing the topic, and we'll take a Q&A for that, and my colleague Doug Savage will be moderating that portion. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker this evening. Dalia Mogahed is Senior Analyst and Executive Director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, a nonpartisan research center dedicated to providing data-driven analysis on the views of Muslim populations around the world. With John Esposito, she is co-author of the book, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. Dalia was recently appointed to President Obama's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, where she serves on the Interreligious Dialogue and Cooperation Task Force. Mogahed also serves on the boards of Freedom House and Women in International Security. Her analysis has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy Magazine, the Harvard International Review, the Middle East Policy Journal, and many other academic and popular journals. You have the rest of her very impressive bio in your handout, and Dalia would like me to emphasize that she does not speak for the White House, neither does she directly advise the President. So if that eliminates any of your questions for the Q&A right now, you can take those out. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dalia Mogahed. Please give her a warm Milwaukee welcome.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this warm welcome and for giving up this gorgeous fall evening in Wisconsin to be here with us instead. I actually grew up just a few hundred miles away in Madison, Wisconsin, so being back in Wisconsin and knowing how rare and amazing these kinds of evenings are, I'm especially touched that you decided to come here. I want to talk to you today about an important topic, a topic that I spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about, and that is the voices of ordinary people. I'm not going to talk to you about the actions of world leaders, of global socio-political dynamics. I'm really here to talk to you about regular people and what they think and feel. Now, I am lucky enough to work for an organization which has built an entire business around this simple idea of helping ordinary people be heard. Dr. Gallup, our founder, said this: if democracy is about the will of the people, someone should go find out what that will is. And he built an entire organization around the simple idea that leaders make better decisions when those decisions are informed by the wisdom of the people. With so much going on in the world, especially in terms of international affairs, no time has it been more urgent to understand the views of ordinary people. Now, to truly hear the voices of a billion Muslims, as the title of the book that I co-authored so boldly claims, we had to do a lot of work. It's not a simple task to actually be able to make that claim. And so what we did was we went into more than 35 majority Muslim or countries with significant Muslim populations and did what we always do. We asked people for their opinions. As you can see, we didn't simply go into the Middle East. We went into sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Europe, and even the United States and Western Europe to ask Muslims around the world what they think and feel. This study represents the largest, most comprehensive research project on public opinion ever done, and it covers 90% of the global Muslim population. Now, when we talk about having a representative sample, before I go into what we actually found out, let me explain just a little bit about our methodology. What we do is we select households from around the country, 1,000 of them, and we interview a member of that household for an hour at least, in-home and face-to-face. I just want to illustrate how we do this with this map of Tanzania. As you can see, the dots, the red dots, which are actually places that we chose as primary sampling units, cover the entire country. They're not simply and easy to get to urban areas. They're in both the city and the countryside to make sure that every single citizen, every single resident, in fact, of the country has a chance to be heard. Whether they have a phone or not, whether they can read or not, whether they can have access to the public space or not, they have a chance to be heard. So all our interviews are in the home, they're face-to-face, and of course they're done in the local languages. They represent young and old, illiterate and educated, men and women, rural as well as urban populations. Another two very important components to keep in mind when really hearing about any survey research is how is it done? First, our research of Muslims around the world is not in isolation. It's actually just a subtopic within a much wider study called the Gallup World Poll, where we cover 140 countries, more than 140, covering 95% of the world's population. Our research is 100% independent, meaning that we fund our own R&D. It's an investment in our future, so we are not beholden to any special interests. This is self-funded and independent research. Now, on 9/11, 2001, our country was attacked. Shortly thereafter, Osama bin Laden was heard praising the attacks, and his statements were laced with religious rhetoric. At the same time, we heard some commentators blame the entire religion of Islam for terrorism. So Sam Harris, for example, who wrote in the Washington Times, "It is time we admitted we are not at war with terrorism, we are at war with Islam." Okay, great. But the voice that we didn't hear so much from was the vast majority who disagreed with both extremes. With all that is at stake for the United States and indeed for the whole world, the time has urgently come to democratize the debate. And that's what this study is all about, giving ordinary people a voice so that we can hear from this silenced majority, silenced by their, in many cases, their own governments, by vocal extremists, and by media that's more interested in sensational headlines than evidence. So we went into people's homes and we asked them questions. Ordinary people, not necessarily especially intellectual. We asked them this question to understand what was really on their minds, what was really going on in terms of the relationship between Muslim communities around the world and the United States and the West in general. What do you admire most about the West? Now, we had been hearing that some people had been saying that Muslims around the world actually hated us for our freedom. So we asked this question: what do you admire most about the West? And here's what we heard. Top two responses were, number one, technology, and number two, liberty and democracy. We also asked the American public the same question, and here were their top responses. Number one, liberty and democracy. Number two, technology. Now, what's especially striking about this result is that this was an open-ended question with an infinite number of possible answers. And yet, such diverse communities around the world could agree that this was what indeed the West was to be respected for, what they admired most about Western civilization. Now, to give you a flavor of what people said, again in their own words, because this was an open-ended question, a Saudi respondent said, freedom of the press, opinion, and expression, also scientific advancement. Iran, social justice, and having access to nuclear power, real democracy. A Pakistani respondent said, law is above all, and everyone observes the law, an admiration of the rule of law. Another said their political system is transparent, and they are following democracy in its true sense. And a Moroccan said, liberty and freedom and being open-minded with each other. Now, I think what's especially striking about these statements is that they do come from ordinary people, but that while many times people may not use the word democracy, they are explaining its basic building blocks in their own words. And so it's not simply that people have a very superficial understanding of what a democracy is and can't even articulate what it really means. That no, at least the basic building blocks are things that people themselves are able to talk about and produce themselves. This is another example of this in a direct question. We asked people if they were to draft a new constitution for a new country, sort of a theoretical idea so that we don't have to make people feel nervous to sort of criticize their own country. But, theoretically, if you were going to create a new constitution for a new country, what rights would you guarantee? And this is the percentage of people who say that they would guarantee freedom of speech. And we defined it for people as the ability to say whatever one wishes about the economic, social, and political realities of the day. Now you can see that the American public is also here. 97% say that they would guarantee freedom of speech, which is wonderful. And Egyptians are actually identical statistically, since our margin of error is plus or minus 3%. But you can tell that there's very little difference across the world on this fundamental right. We also asked people about their dreams for the future, and again, we found a great deal of similarities across the world. We didn't hear about war, but rather work. People across the world said that their dream for the future was a good job. It was a universal desire across the world. The other thing that we heard a lot about was education for their children. And this was heard by majorities in Indonesia, in Iran, and in Egypt. Now, Muslim women are often portrayed in our media as passive, as submissive. For example, in a survey of photographs, the study found that 3/4 of women were depicted in passive capacities, compared with less than 1/6 of men. Now, this is not a study that Gallup conducted. This is a media analysis study done in 1995. But how do Muslim women actually think and feel when you talk to them directly? Well, we found that their actual views are quite different from how they are often portrayed. So this question was one about what women's rights should be, and this was specifically about whether or not a woman should be able to pursue any career outside the home that she wishes to. And as you can see, there's variation across the world, but the majority of women across the world say yes, they should be able to work at any job that they are qualified for. What's interesting is the majority of men, which is represented in this cream color, also think that women should be able to work at any job they are qualified for. Not all of them, but the majority. And now it's interesting to note that the biggest gap, of course, is in Iran and Egypt. And in Malaysia and Lebanon, there is no gap at all. So there's diversity across the world. Not everyone agrees, but the overall thrust is that the majority do believe that women should be out there fulfilling whatever career they want, especially women. Now, all of this should not be understood as a desire to adopt wholesale Western ways of life, because that's not the case either. We found that the most frequent statement associated with Muslim society was attachment to their spiritual and moral values is important to their progress, while the statement least often associated is adopting Western values will help their progress. Now, at the same time, this doesn't mean a desire to isolate. Instead, we found that people were more likely to believe that greater interaction between Muslim societies and Western societies was more a benefit than a threat. It's especially interesting to note the countries that are most interested or most believe that greater interaction is a benefit versus a threat. And it's actually the United States, the American public, which is the strongest in this regard. Other countries that are very strong as well are Iran and Turkey, which I think is quite remarkable. Now, all of this time we've been talking about the West, and really that's just like the concept of the Muslim world. It's a clumsy and inaccurate term because Muslims around the world, in general, do not view the West as monolithic. They differentiate between different countries within the West, depending on their perceptions of those countries' policies. So, here you have the percentage of Egyptians in 2008 who said they had unfavorable opinions of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Pakistan. So what you notice here is that the United States and the United Kingdom don't fare very well. The majority actually have unfavorable views of these two countries in 2008. But France is viewed neutral to positive, and it's actually viewed more positively by Egyptians than is another Muslim majority country, Pakistan. So what you find is that people's views of countries don't fall along religious lines. They fall along the perception of that country's policies. This is actually across 10 Muslim majority countries that we surveyed. We found that 70%, while 70% associated the term ruthless with the United States, only 8% and 6% associated the same with France and Germany. So it's not a wholesale rejection of Western civilization. It is mostly, unfortunately, directed toward the United States. that may be very closely connected to people's disapproval of the Iraq War, which majorities felt did more harm than good. And that includes 57% of even Iranians, which were the most likely to approve of the Iraq War, and all the way down to 94% of Egyptians who thought that the invasion of Iraq did more harm than good. The other thing that drives negative opinion in some countries of the United States is the perception that the U.S. dominates and controls their region. So this question, the U.S. is serious about supporting the establishment of democratic systems of government. Now, we said in the beginning that democracy was one of the things people admired most about the West, yet they don't believe that the United States is serious about promoting or allowing democracy in their region, with some notable exceptions. One of them, of course, is Afghanistan, where the majority do believe that the U.S. is serious about democracy in their country. This idea of democracy is closely related to the idea of self-determination, allowing people to fashion their own political future as they see fit, where similar percentages also disagree along the same lines that the U.S. will allow them to fashion their own political future. The U.S. is seen by some countries, Kuwait, Morocco, Lebanon, as wanting to interfere and control the region. And most of all is this perception of disrespect. So in response to the question, what can the West do to improve relations with the Muslim world, the most frequent response we heard was something close to this. The West should treat Muslims equally to improve their relations because they look down upon us. This perception that Muslims are seen as inferior. And it's interesting because if you think about what the information I've just shared, that democracy is admired, and at the same time, people in many parts of the world don't believe that these same basic values are being allowed to them. This disconnect between admired spouse values or admired values and the perception of how we actually treat Muslims is explained by this idea of disrespect, or this idea of viewing Muslims as inferior, that they're not good enough to enjoy the values that we take for granted. This is the thinking or the analysis that some people take. Now, how accurate is this idea around disrespect? We just asked a direct question across the world. So the question is, do you believe the Western world respects the Muslim world? And not surprising, majorities of Palestinians, Egyptians, Turks, Saudi Arabians, etc., say no, the West does not respect the Muslim world in their view. Now, it's interesting, the majority of Americans actually agree that the West does not respect the Muslim world. So the American public, 54%, also think that the West does not respect the Muslim world. So we asked this question directly, and we asked it about we asked the American public this question. We asked it about several religious groups. Question is, thinking very honestly about your feelings, how much prejudice, if any, do you have against each of the following religious groups? And so here was the self-reported responses that Americans gave about the Jewish community. 72% say none at all, and the remainder admit to having at least some prejudice, with 2% saying a great deal. So this does show us that even though America has made a great deal of progress, anti-Semitism is still not a relic of the past. Now here's what they said about Muslims. 34% said none at all, while the remainder admit to having at least some prejudice, with 19% saying a great deal. We also found that in 2006, Muslims were among the most negatively viewed religious community, with the only exceptions of a community a little worse was atheists and Scientologists. But other than that, Muslims were the most negatively viewed. So what the numbers you see here is 26% said they have a positive view, while 30% said they had a negative view, with a net of -4. And that was in August of 2006. Now, when we measured it again in 2008, we actually found it was a -17. And there are several things that, we can hypothesize of why it got worse. There was, of course, an election in the middle. There was also an economic crisis and soaring fuel prices, which were often talked about in terms of foreign oil and so forth. So there's a lot of different explanations, but we actually found that it actually got significantly worse between these two dates. Now, the American public can hardly be blamed for their perceptions when we look at media content analysis. And the media content analysis is done by a very interesting firm based in Germany named Media Tenor, and you can look up on their website if you want to understand their methodology. It's really a fascinating study. But what they did is they actually looked at words. They actually looked at statements, and they use a code where they rate statements as either negative, neutral, or positive. And so they looked at the percentage of the percentage of negative statements in the months between January of 2007 all the way until March of 2008, which almost exactly fit between the two measurements of our the perception of Muslim communities that I just looked at. And what you see is that in many cases, the majority of the statements are negative. And this is in news. So news is supposed to be all yellow, all neutral. But when it comes to Islam, it's actually mostly negative. So here, the analyst writes, as references to Islam focus primarily on the actions of Sunni and Shia armed groups, negative statements account for more than 40% of all statements in the 14 out of 15 months analyzed by Media Tenor. If you go to the next goal. They also looked at protagonists, meaning who is portraying the faith of Islam and of Christianity in the media. What they found was that the majority of protagonists representing Islam in the media are militants, 53%, while the majority representing Christianity are what we might expect, religious leaders. So what we find is that analysts will tell us that the actual number of militants, armed groups within the Muslim community is a fraction of 1% of the whole community. It's in the thousands, not in the millions. But the representation is much, much higher. So they are definitely overrepresented versus their actual proportion. Next slide. But the question becomes, even if the actual number of violent people is small, how much public support do they enjoy? And that's what we measure. We don't interview militants. We interview general public, and we find out how much support they might enjoy in the general public. So we asked a number of questions to look at this idea of public support for violence. We asked a number of questions, including this one, and I'm just going to give you the entire stem as well as the choices. It starts out like this. There are many acts that some people may do in life. I will read out a number of these acts, and I would like you to indicate to which extent they can be morally justified. Sacrificing your life for a cause you believe in, and that ranges from cannot be justified at all, a 1, all the way to 5, completely justifiable. We also asked about the events of 9/11 in the USA, that is the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and other attacks in which civilians are the targets. So we looked at those 3 questions. Now I'm going to focus first on what's in green, the attacks of 9/11. Here's what we found. Can you go ahead? Great, thank you. This was the breakdown. 55% said completely unjustified, gave that question a 1. 12% gave it a 2, 11 a 3, 7 a 4, and 7% gave that a 5, and also said they had unfavorable views of the United States. So the question becomes, how do we define the group we want to study as the, quote, supporters of violent extremism? So here's what we did to determine how we break this group out and understand and define the politically radicalized. We graphed the 5 groups on this chart, looking at their responses to the other 2 questions. Sacrificing one's life is completely justified, as well as targeting civilians is completely justified. And what we found is that those who responded 1, 2, 3, or 4 to the 9/11 question clustered together, and then the ones who answered a 5 looked distinctively different. This is called a cluster analysis, and this is how scientists determine how to break up groups, by simply allowing the data to show how the groups naturally break up. And so we looked at the 5s and compared them to the rest to understand this group, this distinct group that we termed politically radicalized. We wanted to know how they were different or similar to the rest of the population. And here's what we found. Go ahead. The first finding was actually the lack of a finding. We found no statistical difference in the 2 groups' religiosity. Both were equally likely to say religion was an important part of their daily life. Go ahead. I actually show this picture because she, one of our respondents, is one of the most caustic anti-American respondent we actually talked to, and yet she wouldn't fit the stereotype of someone that might be a militant or a militant sympathizer, and just kind of changes our perception of what we're actually, what the stereotype of this type of thing. We also asked people, after they told us how they felt about 9/11, to justify their views, to explain why. Whether they condemned it or condoned it, we asked them, why do you say that? And here's what we heard. For the contrast group, these were the reasons that they gave us. Loss of innocent life, murder hated by God. People said that they were against 9/11 because of their values. Sometimes they would describe those values in humanitarian terms. Other times they would describe them, their ethical values, in terms of religious justifications. So sometimes people would actually quote from the Quran and say that killing one life is as if you've killed all of humanity. Condemning terrorism in terms of humanitarian as well as religious justifications. In contrast, the 7% that we defined as the politically radicalized, not a single one of them quoted from religious scripture. Instead, they cited political justifications. They talked about America being an imperialist power. They also talked in terms of revenge, tit for tat, that America kills civilians, and this is simply a response to that. It's also important to look at the universal rejection. We can't just focus on the support for terrorism as much as it exists. We also have to look more broadly. The universal rejection of attacks on civilians. What we found is that Muslim communities are as likely as the American public to say to reject attacks on civilians. So whereas 6% of Americans tell us that they think it's completely justified to target civilians. That number is 4% in Saudi Arabia and 2% in Lebanon and Iran, all within our margin of error. Interestingly, we also found that when asked what can the Muslim world do to improve relations with the West, you'll see that reduced extremism is higher in frequency among Muslims than it is even among Americans in response to that same question. That Muslims are more concerned about terrorism than are Americans. And when we ask people to explain, to tell us their greatest fear for their country, terrorism or being a victim of terrorism comes up higher for Muslim communities around the world than it actually does for Americans. And it's very easy to understand why. If you look at the numbers, the primary victims of terrorism are, in fact, Muslims. Some of the other responses that I think are interesting to note is after reducing extremism, people said demonstrate more flexible attitudes toward the West, respect the other's positive thinking. So again, the concept of reciprocal exchanges of respect, establish and promote relations based on mutual respect with the West, and improve presentation of Islam. So whereas people were asking for Islam to be respected, they also felt that it was part of their that they had something to contribute in educating people. As for the American public, in response to the question, what can the Muslim world do to improve relations with the West, the most frequent response was improve communication, followed by for Muslims to control, stop extremism, then to better understand each other, and then finally to accept our way of doing things. And in the end, what we have to really take away from this is that the conflict that exists between Muslim communities and the United States is not inevitable because it's based on perceptions of politics and not a contradiction in principles or values. We also have to keep in mind a longer view of history. So, for example, 90% of both Muslims and Christians in Lebanon have a positive view of each other. Only a few decades after a civil war fought roughly along confessional lines. Today, the majority of blacks and whites say that the relationship between the two races is good, only a generation after the civil rights struggle. Whereas in 1958, only 4% of Americans approved of marriage between blacks and whites. Today, that number is 80%. And of course, we elected our first African-American president. Now, what's so interesting about the election of Barack Obama is that Virginia is a very important state. It was a swing state. It was a state that he really needed to win. And of course, we know that Virginians have been voting, or the Electoral College has been going to Republicans for several decades. And President Obama was one of the first, or the first Democrat to win the state since 1967, I think, although don't quote me on the year. What's interesting is that when he was born, his parents' marriage was illegal in Virginia. So it shows us how quickly things can change and how quickly people, even groups that have been in conflict for centuries, can improve relations. So in the end, we should allow ordinary people to speak for themselves instead of permitting extremists to monopolize the conversation, and thus let facts, not fear, shape our global engagement. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Some fascinating data there and equally fascinating analysis. You know, I'd like to sort of abuse my prerogative here and ask the first question, if I could. Do you have any data along the lines of perceptions of the U.S. following Obama's Cairo speech?
That's a great question. I actually had the pleasure of attending the Cairo speech in the University of Cairo, and was in the region at that time. And I can tell you, just anecdotally at least, what an amazing impact the Cairo speech had. People were just elated and deeply, deeply moved by the speech. There was also a poll that was done before and after the Cairo speech, which also showed a significant improvement in opinions. But improvements of views of the United States happen even before the Cairo speech. Just with our change in leadership, we went up by an average of 15 to 20% in approval rating.
Well, let's open up to the floor. Fred.
Microphone coming?
Yeah, we have
I'd be very interested in how you chose the people that you showed a map of Tanzania and red dots all over the country. You presumably have local contacts. Do you pretty much rely on them both to choose the target contacts, but also to conduct the interviews? They have to be done in local language.
Right. That's a really good question, and that's the part of our...
Use the microphone.
Is my mic not on?
No.
Okay. Let me see here.
I think it's on. We just use this one. Pull it. Put up a little crunching there. There we go.
Okay, great. The part of our methodology that you're asking about is one that we invest the most time and energy in, and that is to train and supervise our local vendors, because all of our interviews are done in language by local people. Our sampling frame, however, is one that we come up with, and then we train local people on, and then we supervise the interviews. We have regional research directors go all over the world. Each one has their specific region that conduct this training and supervision for our research. So the specific homes are chosen according to our stratified random sampling methodology that we train and supervise local people to conduct.
Great. Another question. Yes, the back.
You said something at the beginning. You said something at the beginning about the wisdom of the people. And I have to tell you that I didn't think I had, or I realized I didn't have much wisdom until I was 65 years old, and that was 15 years ago. I don't think that the people have much wisdom. In fact, the fact that they voted for both Bush and Obama is sufficient. It's sufficient for me to believe that the people don't have wisdom. And I see very little reason to believe that a democracy can last forever. I don't think that it can last any longer than any other form of government. And we might very well become a dictatorship 30 years from now, for all I know. And I think that this is because the people lack wisdom. In fact, I'm afraid. Well, you want me to quit asking?
Feel free to ask.
I mean, do you really believe that the people have wisdom?
That's an interesting question. I'm really just conveying to you the belief of our founder, Dr. Gallup, who did believe that that no, policies shouldn't be put out for a vote, but that leaders do make better decisions when they are well informed. And part of that is understanding, knowing what is the will of the people, understanding what people want as a part of their decision-making process.
Yes.
Kind of two parts here. The first part, real quick, is in the countries, how many people said no, thank you?
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
In the countries, how many people said no thank you? Was it statistically in any country that said I will not participate? And then the other thing was I was looking at the statistics, and Kuwait, we had roughly a 20 years ago influence on Kuwait, and they seem to be not real pleased with how the West has interacted with them from the statistic you showed.
Well, the first question is really about our non-response rate. How many people weren't willing to talk? And actually, the number is very, very low. So our non-response rate for the United States overall is more than 50%. It's actually very hard to get people to do a survey in general. And Gallup has one of the best response rates because people recognize the name. But I'll just talk about the Middle East. It's very, the non-response rate is about 5%. So it was amazingly high. People were amazingly willing to let someone into their home and have a conversation. So that's one thing. So our CEO sometimes makes this point that our poll of Iraq is more accurate than our poll of the United States because of that idea of the response rate. People, it's just a different kind of cultural norm around that. And then the issue of Kuwait, I think it's very interesting, and a lot of times people find it very striking that Kuwaitis are negative about the United States despite the intervention with Gulf War I. And it's an interesting finding, and it's hard for me to explain exactly why. But they look similar to other parts of the region in terms of their concern about the invasion of Iraq, at least the second time. So you have to remember that the destabilization of Iraq does affect them, and there is a spillover, and I think a lot of Kuwaitis might be concerned about that. But that's just one possible explanation.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Do you have plans to resurvey, and if yes, how frequently?
Yes, it's an ongoing study, and we do resurvey every year. We will be coming out with our 2009 data early next year, once it's all in and analyzed. But it is an ongoing study, and you can actually, if we can go to one more slide, I forgot that I have this website is where you can go to look at our latest findings, where this gets updated weekly.
In your poll, were you able to detect either a precipitating or a series of precipitating events that would have changed Muslims' views of the United States, similar to what, let's say, 9/11, the Marine Corps barracks explosion, and those types of things? I don't know if that was in your poll, and if there wasn't, do you have any insight?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are some. From the data we do have, I would say the invasion of Iraq is one. The Abu Ghraib pictures, when they came out, that was a very significant issue. Actually, I'm not sure that we all sort of understand how much it was an impactful issue. And then just sometimes just specific rhetoric. The crusade comment was taken and really magnified, and people, come up with that a lot and talk about it. And actually, the other thing that I think, we talk a lot about the war in Iraq, and I think many people understand that it was an unpopular war among many Muslim communities. But the other thing to keep in mind is the war in Afghanistan actually was too, and I think that's harder for people to understand, but it is important to know that. And the way I can explain it is this. Terrorism is something that many of these countries have been dealing with for decades. And the way it was always dealt with is in the form of crime. It's a crime that, you sort of had law enforcement to go after people, arrest them, put them in jail. But it wasn't, so that's what people expected, is sort of to respond to it in terms of a crime rather than to actually attack with an entire army in the country. So it was this, whether we agree with that perception or not, even the war in Afghanistan was seen as an invasion that was unjustified. That people expected more of a counterterrorism response rather than more of a general attack on the country. So those, I think, were the events that I would point to.
Hi, Dalia. Thank you. It's always good to hear. I always learn something every time I hear something from you. I have a question, which is generally a difficult subject, and I'm not sure how much you've done or continuing to do, and that is Muslims' perception of the relationship that the United States has with Israel. And how is that seen, specifically since President Obama? As you know, I work with a lot of Muslims that come to the United States, and many of them come with a very unfavorable understanding. When they come to the United States and they often meet many different types of groups that work around the Israeli-Palestinian issue, they still come back, no matter how much exposure there is, still with a lot of mixed up understanding of what that relationship is, the complexities of it. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry if that's not a clear question, but...
No, I think the impact of, the perception around the world of our relationship, or the United States relationship with Israel, is that it is not an even-handed relationship, or that we are not even-handed in our brokerage of peace. So one question, we found that only 5 to 7% associated even-handed approach to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict with the United States. So it's a very small percentage, and it was the lowest percentage that associated any statement with the United States. So that's one just overall perception, is we're seen to be very biased toward Israel. Now, how impactful is this in regards to people's views of the United States? And the answer is it really depends on where you are. So in the Middle East, in the Arab world, this issue is very central, and it does come up in open-ended questions, and it's something a lot of people are concerned about. Once you get out of the Arab world, this isn't something that comes up as often. Now, when you ask people directly, they are very concerned, but it's not something that spontaneously is mentioned by Muslims outside of the Middle East. So that's how I'd really put it, inside the Middle East, it's very important, very central issue, but outside, it's less important. Now, one thing I think is interesting to note, though, is that this same poll that I was referring to of Egyptians, there was an open-ended question asked, what do you think was the most important topic that the president covered during his speech? And this is an open-ended question. The most frequent response was the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This is among Egyptians. And it was, I think, 48% of the people all agreed on that. And then the second most frequent was 22%, so less than half. And they said U.S. relationship with Muslims, which is actually what the entire speech was about, but it got a lot less attention. So at least Egyptians and much of the Middle East, as you look at the media, were very focused on this topic when it came to the president's speech, and for the most part felt that he took a pretty even-handed approach in his speech, and expectations were raised very high that he would take a strong stance against settlements.
And can you remind us just demographically how much of the Muslim world do Arabs account for?
They account for 15 to 20%.
Very good. Another question.
Do you have any way of assessing whether individual people that you're talking to are telling you what you want to hear rather than what they really think, or might be cowed by a suspicion that somehow it's going to get back to their government, and their governments are, in many cases, not particularly free? So I'd just like to hear your methodology in that regard.
Well, that's a huge concern, of course, and something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. And we do a number of things to try to get around this problem. Now, I will say, though, first, even in non-authoritarian countries, social desirability is an issue that survey research has to overcome no matter what. So there's, first, just to get around social desirability, we ask questions, and this is really an art, and you have to, we go through this entire process of evaluation and having different people review our questionnaires and so forth, even within our organization. But it's to make questions as neutral as you possibly can, to not have leading questions, to not have questions with an obvious right answer, and to allow people to feel that any choice they make is equally okay. So that's one thing, is just how you craft questions. The second thing you do is you have to put sensitive questions further down in the questionnaire. Once people have created a trust and rapport with their interviewer. Third thing is we do things in-home and face-to-face, not over the phone, not over the internet. And that does help to help people feel more comfortable speaking their minds because they're not afraid of someone listening in. Another thing we do is we ask questions, in many cases, in open-ended form. And what that does is it allows people to speak without being kind of boxed into a specific answer or another. Open-ended questions can allow us to get at things that may be very hard to get at. So, for example, one question we ask is, like we asked, what do you admire most about the West? We also ask, what do you admire most about the Muslim world, and what do you resent most about the Muslim world, or what do you admire least about the Muslim world? Now, the Muslim world's a general, kind of ambiguous topic, but what you really hear is what they criticize most about their own country. So you have people saying corruption, nepotism, and lack of freedom. Well, they're probably talking, and they happen to be from countries that have these three problems. They're probably talking about their own country. And so, but you're giving them the space to talk about something in a more general way, and to be able to still speak their mind. Finally, we also try to use outside kind of confirmation for what people are telling us. So one thing we do is we look at perceptions of corruption. Now, corruption is a sensitive thing, and a lot of times we might assume that people aren't honest about their perception of corruption. So we say, how much corruption, if any, do you believe exists in the government and in business? And we look at people's responses to that, and we take countries and rank them based on just people's responses to those questions, and we compare that ranking to Transparency International. And we look, because if people are just completely giving us wrong answers, those shouldn't match at all. But they do. They actually match about a 0.8 correlation. We also look at other questions like confidence in local elections. And again, they actually kind of make sense. People with poor elections do rate their elections poorly, or at least, only a small percentage say that they have confidence. So we do a number of things to get around this problem. But in the end, I'm the first to say that polling is not a perfect tool. It's not. We're not mind readers, and we are going to have some level of ambiguity and inaccuracy in our work. But I go back and I quote or I paraphrase Winston Churchill, who said that democracy is the worst system except every other system we've ever tried. And I say the same thing about polling. It is the worst way to understand societies except every other tool we have at our disposal. So it's a tool, it has its use, but it also has its limitations.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming and speaking with us this evening.
It's my pleasure, thank you.
My question is, what is being done with the wealth of data that you've collected to help promote change in the world?
Well, I always say we're not trying to promote anything, just trying to get the data out there and educate people. We very strongly guard against any partisanship or advocacy. But what we are trying to do is disseminate the data, and that's what the Muslim West Facts Project is about, and that's what the website is. And it's a project in partnership, Gallup in partnership with the Coexist Foundation, and its goal, its mission is to disseminate the findings, to give people a voice by spreading the information to opinion leaders and the public in Muslim societies as well as Western societies. And this program is a part of that, is getting this information out to citizens who are interested. I also, me and my team, travel the world and brief leaders. So I've talked to everyone from Madeleine Albright to the Grand Mufti of Egypt. And we're getting this information out to the world, not just one community or another. It's also important to educate Muslim societies about what Americans think, what Muslims think, and what Europeans think. So it's really, the whole goal of the project is to allow ordinary people to speak for themselves.
I think you should wait for the mic if you could.
You spoke about the Western news organizations and that statistic you had on the bias of the reporting, which is great, and it is that way. What do we get in our living rooms? We get when there's a bomb explodes and this or that happens. So is that a bias against Muslims, or is that just news being sensational? And how would you change that?
Right.
I mean, you're not going to report on people's everyday lives.
Right. Well, I think it's an interesting point. You're right. If it bleeds, it leads, and of course we're going to have to keep reporting on acute conflicts, and right now those acute conflicts involve Muslims. Now, I don't know how to change that. I would say, however, that there is a number of ways to frame a conflict or an act of violence. And what this media content analysis was looking at is not negative statements about violence or about Iraq or about the conflict, but actually negative statements about Islam as a faith. So the violence is being framed in terms of Islam as a faith, and I think that's the issue: is how is it explained and how is it framed, rather than we're simply reporting on it. We actually, I wanted to also say that it doesn't have to be this way, because a more recent study of media found that while most networks had this kind of a record, very red, that CNN was an exception, and that most of its reporting on the exact same topic was yellow, was neutral. So it is possible to still report on the conflict, but using neutral statements rather than value-laden statements.
Another question. Can I ask another? Sure. You use the word terrorism in a very limited sense, and you were speaking about understanding history, but it comes from the reign of terror during the French Revolution, and it was the government which spread the terror. So, we've had our own terrorist organizations here. The Ku Klux Klan was a terrorist organization, so was the Birmingham Police Force. But Ahmadinejad is a terrorist, Stalin was a terrorist, I think that we think of terrorism only people who blow up places, but I wonder how you would feel about this definition of terrorism.
Well, the definition of terrorism is highly contested. It's a hugely debated topic, and there are huge debates about it in the UN. In fact, it was the United States that insisted that terrorism be defined specifically as non-state actors. And it was us in the UN that was making that point the strongest. The general definition that people wanted to use was deliberately targeting civilians to scare the rest of the population without defining who was doing it, but the idea of a non-state actor. So our State Department does define terrorism as requiring it to be an act of violence against civilians that is committed by a non-state actor. But there are people who define terrorism in a broader way.
I wonder if you could say a few things about the challenges that Afghanistan presented for your research and how you and your colleagues overcame those challenges.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking. Afghanistan was a huge challenge, as is Iraq, because of security issues. In Afghanistan, there were specific areas of the country, while limited, but still we could not enter. So there were parts that we couldn't enter and had to wait the data so that they were accounted for. But it was just our vendors were just really the heroes of the story and trying to conduct the research in a war zone, in a country where people are just afraid to walk outside. We continued to do research in Afghanistan as well as in Pakistan and in Iraq, but they do present the biggest challenge. Zimbabwe is another example where there was a huge amount of fear, and the data had to be collected very quickly, in only a week in Zimbabwe.
Two questions. One, you mentioned this issue about how some people try to frame their answers based on social desirability. So, for example, in the United States, if you asked about interracial marriage, they may tend to give you, "Oh no, I'm okay with it," although they may be against it. Do you see that this would be a problem for the Muslim community when you have so much of the media? And when I say media, I don't mean the normal media, but kind of the Fox, the advocacy type, where they have a particular message that they want to give, that it may be socially desirable not to approve of Muslims and so forth. I mean, how does that come into play, if at all? Second is, can you just talk about the correlation between attitude toward Muslims and having a knowledge about Islam and Muslims?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, that it would be socially desirable to actually say you have prejudice against a group. That's a straight, I've never thought of it, but I have no idea if that could be the case or not. I mean, our society is very sensitive in general to the concept of prejudice, so saying you have any prejudice is unusual. But this much prejudice, where it's actually a majority admit to some, is highly, unlikely. But here it is. So is there social pressure to express that, even though people don't feel it? I'm not sure. That's an interesting question. I'm not sure what that. I have no way of knowing. But it would be saying something if there was social pressure to actually self-report something that's socially undesirable. I think that's even itself saying something. The second question was the connection or the correlation between knowledge of Islam and prejudice or self-reported prejudice against Muslims. And we were talking about this at dinner. It's a very interesting correlation. It's a non-linear correlation. So people who say they know absolutely nothing about Islam, their own self-reported level of knowledge is nothing, have no prejudice, or more likely to have no prejudice toward Muslims. At the same time, people who say they have a great deal of knowledge about Islam also say they have no prejudice. So if you have no knowledge or a lot of knowledge, you don't have prejudice. It's the middle group of people who say they know something. They're the ones that are more likely to actually have some level of prejudice. So a little bit of knowledge does appear to be a dangerous thing in this case.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. And then we'll go here.
Thank you very much. This has been absolutely enlightening, so thank you. The way you presented the data, it looks that there might be some geographical differences, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more. And I don't know if they're regional or maybe proximity to other places, but that would be very helpful.
There really are. I would say that the most, if we talk about globally, so if we just look at the whole world, not just Muslim societies, the two areas of the world where there is the most, or at least in 2008, the greatest amount of anti-American sentiment would be the Middle East, and then even worse, Western Europe, among the general population, our closest allies. The places where there is the most pro-American sentiment is actually among sub-Saharan African populations, including Muslims. So one way to think about it is the most pro-American people in the world are actually Muslims, and they are in sub-Saharan Africa. And some of the most anti-American people in the world are, German, French, and Spanish general public. That was in 2008. Things have changed since Obama was elected. So that's geographically. But within the Muslim world, the Middle East and the proximity to Iraq and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict tend to be where the hot spots are for the most anti-American sentiment and sort of anger. As you move away from that, as I said, in sub-Saharan Africa, very positive feelings. In Asia, it kind of depends. Pakistan's more negative than Indonesia and Malaysia. So it seems to be proximity to acute conflicts in which the United States is involved is a rough approximation of how people tend to view us.
You rightly said that you have more problem putting the data in the United States than other countries. Just looking at your religious prejudices in different groups, why a Christian majority country like us would have more negative view of Christianity than the Jewish faith? And so maybe there is an issue with that prejudices against Muslims, very favorable toward Jews, and not so good about Christians themselves. Mm-hmm. That raises a certain issue.
Well, that's an interesting question. Now, I think what you were referring to is the slide that looks at favorability. And you're right, the most favorably viewed group in the United States are Jews, according to that data, with Catholics being second. Now, Catholics are a minority group within the larger Christian community, but they're the second most favorably viewed. It's not Christians, it is Catholics. When you look at prejudice, though, people have less prejudice toward Christians than they do toward Jews. So when we look at just like prejudice, we actually look at four groups: Christians, Jews, Buddhists, and Muslims. And the least amount of self-reported prejudice is against Christians. So a majority Christian country isn't prejudiced against Christians. That's not that surprising. But very, very similar, although more, is Jews. So there is more prejudice toward Jews, self-reported, than there is toward Christians. And then Buddhists are hardly anyone has prejudice against them, and then Muslims are, as you saw.
Pat?
I also have two questions, if I may. The first one goes back to the very first comment about people are not very well informed and educated. And I think that be some truth to that. If you took a poll of 100 people walking down Wisconsin Avenue and asked them who the President of the United States is, you'd probably be surprised at the percentage that says they don't know. If you ask them who the President of Canada is, or the Prime Minister of Canada is, or the Prime Minister of a European country or Japanese country, I mean, it would be a handful of people that could tell you that. So when I see your map and I see you asking people around the countryside, or just to pick a country, Tanzania as an example, I think the same thing would apply there. So did you delve into the information and dissect it by education level and or levels of wealth, perhaps, that would show differences within a particular country of opinion? So that's question one.
Absolutely, yeah.
And question two, the one slide that you had, I don't remember which one was exactly, but I was surprised by Egypt had a particularly unfavorable view of, I think it was of the West, or what particular side, but I was just focusing on Egypt was so low. And when I think of the fact that Egypt is the second biggest recipient, I think, of foreign aid from the United States, it's somewhat surprising that that number was so much more out of sync with everybody else.
Right. Well, the level of education is your first question, is how did we look at level of education? We did, and it follows somewhat the same trend as the prejudice trend that I just explained. People who were very uneducated or illiterate actually tended to have more positive views, or they weren't very angry. It was actually the more educated people who tended to have more negative views of U.S. policies, although they were more likely to express admiration for our values. So that's sort of an interesting maybe somewhat counterintuitive finding. The second piece is about Egypt. And yes, you're right. You notice that Egypt did tend to look remarkably negative on almost everything. So they were the most likely to say that the Iraq War did more harm than good. And they were the most likely or the second most likely, I think, to say that they thought the West did not respect the Muslim world. But Egyptians are interesting in that they are, in some ways, the most angry, and in some ways also the most eager to improve relations. So when we ask, is improving relations with the West important to you, they're also the highest in that. And so they expect, they're deeply invested in this relationship. I was at this conference about U.S.-Egypt relations, and it was interesting because basically people said Egyptians think about the relationship with America like every day, and how often do Americans sort of think our relationship with Egypt? Probably never. So it's something that they're much more focused on. Now about the aid is viewed in a very there's sort of a mixed view of the aid. Okay, first of all, most of our aid is military aid, so it isn't something that ordinary people really see very much. Now, what is economic aid is viewed in a mixed way. So some of it does help people directly, and some of it is viewed by some as hurting Egypt. And here's how it sometimes can be viewed as hurting Egypt. It's very complex, but basically some people believe that the aid hurts Egypt's local agricultural economy, that our subsidized flour, wheat, or corn is sort of dumped into the economy, hurting local farmers that are then unable to compete with that. Some people also believe the aid is just a tool of, imposing our values by manipulating curriculums and things like that. So there's a lot of confusion about the aid. It unfortunately isn't really managed in such a way where it's benefiting or it's building the goodwill that we expect it to. In some cases, the aid is actually resented. So there's a lot of work to do when it comes to Egypt and aid, and there's something that a lot of people are working on, but it's much more complicated than we might think in terms of how it's actually impacting people's lives.
Thank you for your presentation. The question that I have is, when I was looking at your chart of the countries that seem to be more angry with the West, at least in the brief time that I looked at the chart, it seemed that the populations that were the most angry were also the ones that our government had a direct role in maybe propping up their governments or influencing their governments. Whereas, for example, let's say Indonesia, you mentioned didn't really have such an unfavorable view. Well, we really don't have that much effect on the government in Indonesia. Whereas, for example, Egypt, if you talk to many Arabs, they have a huge problem with the leadership of Mubarak and the fact that he's being propped up to some degree by the United States. So I'm just wondering that if there is that correlation also.
I think that's also a possible explanation of some of that. I would say that there are really three things, as you look at all of the data, that are the prisms or the filters or the lenses through which people view the words and actions of the United States. One is through the lens of acute conflict, so the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Two is this perception of disrespect, which has a lot in there. And then three is this idea of hegemony or political control of the region, which would include, in some cases, supporting governments that are not popular with people.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. If I could ask you to do two things. Take a moment to fill out the evaluation forms. That will certainly help us. And to thank our guests for being with us tonight.